Now 1 minute after the hour, so I think we will get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you all for tuning in today. On behalf of Biotech Canada, we are thrilled to feature 4 experts from Deloitte for a virtual session on economic outlooks in the time of COVID-19, some practical advice on IRAP's Innovation Assistance Program and maybe some other programs, and some useful insights on supply chain and capital markets, some of which will be in the context of the biotechnology and life sciences industry. We've got Anita Shinde, Joyce Drohan, Lopes, and Jason Ding here with us today. So before we begin, I want to bring your attention to the Q&A feature. So if you hover your mouse pointer down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a gray menu that appears with a Q&A button, hopefully visible there. So for the participants, we're going to do the Q&A period after all speakers have presented. So you can go ahead and type your questions in there if you have any. And then in the top right corner of your screen, you'll see an option to go into speaker view or gallery view. You may already be in gallery view, but if you'd like to switch it to speaker view so that the screen features the person who is speaking at the time, that may work better. So with that, I will turn myself on mute and turn off my video and hand it over to our first speaker, which I think we have just switched it to Anita Shinde. So she's going to take it away and then pass it off to Joyce. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate that. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing very well and safe, and I'm happy to be part of this important discussion today. I know that I speak for the rest of the Deloitte team in saying that. Just briefly, in terms of my background, I am focused on economic advisory at Deloitte. I have spent the past 15 years or so in this space. And essentially what we do is we advise our clients on various issues or challenges that they're facing, which would benefit from economic analysis and perspective. I am certainly industry agnostic, but have spent a great deal of time focused in the areas of technology, healthcare, agri-food, agri-technology, and manufacturing, as well as a few examples, as well as the public sector. Our economic advisory practice at Deloitte is also home to Deloitte Canada's chief economist, Craig Alexander, who leads all of our macroeconomic forecasting, analysis, and commentary. And so today what I wanted to do is just focus on first sharing some of the highlights from the chief economist's commentary in recent days regarding the economic state, as well as share a bit about our COVID-19 economic recovery dashboard. And then I'll speak a little bit more about economic advisory and just some of the hot topics that we're finding with organizations that we're working with in this space, firms as well as nonprofits. So first, just a summary in terms of current state from an economic perspective. So globally, nationally, of course, we are in a very challenging state from an economic perspective. Our economic performance is really impacted and now contingent on COVID-19 in terms of where we go from here and flattening that curve and slowing the pace of new cases. The impact so far to the economy has really been vast and certainly significant, whereby supply chains, exports, business operations, employment across a number of industries has been very hard hit. Transportation, tourism, brick and mortar retail are a few examples of where we've really seen some of that challenge, while there have been areas such as online retail and health, of course, where we are experiencing growth at the same time. In terms of some key statistics to flag here, the International Monetary Fund recently put out its global forecast for sort of a path to recovery. It views the global economy will contract by 3% this year, which, just to put in perspective, the recession of 2008, 2009, we experienced a 0.1% in global economic contraction. So very significant drop. The same forecast for Canada predicts that we'll contract by 6.2% this year, but then start to rebound next year at 4.2%. So we're seeing a bit more impact here in Canada, and certainly you'll see that this is COVID-19 related when you think about some of the other countries and where they're projected to go. Italy, Spain are more in the 8.9% economic contraction according to the International Monetary Fund. Deloitte forecasts are pretty much aligned, perhaps a bit more optimistic. And for Canada, we expect to start to see some rebound happening towards the end of this year, mid Q3, and then seeing some of that recovery by about mid 2022. So certainly a longer path towards recovery. On the unemployment side, we are sitting at about 10.7% right now. And this is, of course, concerning given all of the individuals who have been impacted in those hard-hit industries. If you are lower income, if you were challenged to access gainful employment before COVID-19, these are all certainly vulnerable population groups that the government is starting to pay a great deal of attention to in terms of some of the fiscal measures we're seeing. Generally speaking, forecasters are challenged to assess the degree of economic decline. It's very challenging. There's lots of uncertainty around COVID-19 and when we'll be able to see that flattening of the curve. Different geographies are experiencing different paces of improvement, and so there's a very large coordination effort when it comes to being able to open up economies, of course. But there is broad consensus around, in Canada, some of the fiscal measures that we're seeing being targeted in the right way when it comes to helping businesses for business continuity, liquidity, impacting some of those unemployment numbers through the wage subsidy program. We see support for smaller businesses coming out, for students, and of course this large focus on innovation as well, which we'll certainly spend more time on today. But given all of the challenges around sort of predicting what will happen, essentially many economists are focusing on tracking real-time data and policy measures and announcements on pretty much a day-to-day basis to help see what that path to recovery looks like in real time. And that brings me to Deloitte's Economic Recovery Dashboard. This is a very robust, dynamic tool, and I'll share it with everyone through a link following this call. It's a bit dynamic to go through via Zoom, but essentially it's a dashboard that tracks a range of health, financial, and economic data in real time to help us see what that recovery path looks like pretty much on a day-by-day basis. So on the health side, we're seeing updated data every day on new cases, fatalities across the country, and that's sourced through Johns Hopkins. On the economic side, we do have some of those traditional metrics that I mentioned, but there is a lag effect when it comes to economic indicators and how they're measured and when that data is available. So we've included as well in this dashboard some really interesting, more on the ground data points that give us a sense of activity, of consumer sentiment, and potentially consumer behavior. And these types of indicators include social media, foot traffic for restaurants, foot traffic to brick and mortar retail. And when we start to see some of those patterns changing, it's really a signal to us that things are starting to resume a little bit more on the normal side. So it's a great tool. It's accessible to anyone, and as I said, I will share that with all of you. Also, some resources that I can share. Our chief economist, Craig Alexander, produces daily updates based on some of those announcements that come out from various sources of government, based on how the economy is looking, and certainly some web series that will follow in the weeks to come. So happy to share those resources with all of you to answer any more of those economic outlook questions that you may have as we move forward. Now, just on the economic advisory side, which is more my area of focus, I just wanted to share a couple of points around what we've seen recently working with public, private, and nonprofit organizations as they look to navigate these very challenging times. Just a couple examples that I'll flag. And the first is really about essentially scenario analysis, scenario planning. And this is something we're seeing, of course, government do. We are seeing it on the health side, but also on the government planning side. In economics, we are doing this quite often to understand, what is the impact of different scenarios that may happen as a result of COVID-19. So also at the organizational level, at the firm level, we are seeing great interest around being able to analyze how the changes that are before us, if the recession lasts a little bit longer, if your supply chain situation, ranges between a couple different scenarios, what does that mean for your business, for your organization? What does that look like from a data perspective? And certainly, revenue, employment, all of those key metrics, but then really informing sort of an effective strategy around how to go about dealing with those various scenarios. This is something that we're seeing and having many conversations with organizations about. The second area that I would flag is this piece around communicating economic and social value creation. And it's something that we focus on quite a bit before COVID-19 even hit, but I think it's now more at the forefront. So essentially, there's a lot of analysis and work that can be done to understand, analyze economic and social value being created at an organizational level or an industry level, a sector level, to speak about, of course, things like jobs and GDP impacts, but also, other types of social drivers. And I think as we move forward towards recovery, and as government continues to think about different funding mechanisms and programs, economic development supports that they may initiate, they will be very interested in a lot of these types of indicators when it comes to employment or any other factors that would help address some of the situations, the challenges that have arisen from this crisis. And that kind of leads into this piece, I think, on innovation, which is really critical. From an economic perspective, innovation is something that we have been talking about for a very long time. In Canada, when we look at economic growth and economic competitiveness, innovation is something that we tend to lag behind some of our peer countries, the countries that we compete with for investment or talent pre-COVID-19. And so it's always been something that, of course, we are very focused on in terms of investing in R&D, commercializing, thinking of patents, all of that activity is something that we pay a great deal of focus on. But then also now, even more so, that we have all of these different challenges that are very specific to healthcare, to biotechnology, to life sciences. There's really that opportunity to focus on innovation, of course, and help address some of these potentially really critical issues. So that's certainly part of that ongoing conversation around economic impact and being able to position almost, a business case narrative at an organizational level or industry level. That's something that we're seeing quite a bit of. So with that, I think I'll wrap here and say thanks for the time today. And as I said, we will share some of those key resources with you following the call. And Joyce, I think I'll be passing it over to you now.
Thanks, Anita. So hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting us to present to you today. Just by way of introduction, I'm Joyce Drohan. I'm a partner for Deloitte. I lead the Omnia artificial intelligence practice and the healthcare sector market leader for Deloitte. What I wanted to do was talk about a little bit around supply chain. And as we're talking about supply chain and how we're working with different organizations, currently Deloitte is supporting 3 provinces as well as the federal government. As you can imagine, things are moving quite quickly in terms of how COVID has taken hold and in terms of the pandemic response. Interestingly enough, especially in Canada, the public health response has been quite good. We don't have a situation like they have in Lombardy, Italy, or in New York City, or in some of the other states in the US right now, and we're quite fortunate from that perspective. And what's happened is that mainly the PPE drive that we're working on right now is actually more based on kind of universal PPE requirements. And, we need to look at it from a supply. These are now critical supplies across the globe, and then demand. The other area that we're working in as well is around critical drugs. So critical drugs as well is something that's being looked at across all the provinces and in Health Canada as well, where we have a number of there's always been stockouts around the world of various drugs at various points in time, but they're usually regionally focused, or they're usually kind of one drug category based on an ingredient makes things go a little bit wonky. But what happens in this point is that there's a drug shortage generally around the world. So if you imagine when you hear about on the news when people are short of ventilators that they're using for COVID-19 patients that are in ICU, what we also have is we have a shortage of the anesthetics like propofol and things like that that are actually required to actually intubate a patient. So those are things now that are becoming in short supply. Other things like bronchodilators like Ventolin are becoming in short supply as well now. And many of the provinces and countries around the world now are starting to go to secondary drug lists. Now, this becomes more critical from the perspective, as I mentioned, that you're losing the fact that this isn't regional, so we can't just say this is a Canadian or North American issue. Let's source this from Europe. They're having the same challenges as we do. The other one is the lead time. So as we have, unlike PPE, where we can have alternative manufacturers that are like liquor distributors that are making hand sanitizer, you can't just decide that there's going to be another manufacturer of a bronchodilator, or there's going to be another manufacturer of a painkiller. It just doesn't work that way. So lead times are upwards of 6 months into the supply chain as well. A lot of the critical supplies now have gone into secondary substitution supplies. So if you don't have enough of this, now you're substituting the next one. So that leads to secondary shortage as well. So again, as we're looking at it, there's a domino effect inside of the substitutions that are happening with organizations as well. So most of them now are looking at how they're actually managing the current pandemic, but then also looking at the recovery phase that they're going to have as well. So interesting enough, while we're still in pandemic, we're managing to now plan for recovery phase around critical supplies, which will now include many of the items. There's one province right now that we're working with, that one of the cities alone, with the 6-week slowdown in elective procedures now, they have a backlog of over 30,000 cases now that need to go through. The talks right now that we're having are potentially that people are wanting to run ORs now for 24 hours a day. And now with that 24 hours a day for the next 7 days a week, to now see how we can get rid of some of the backlog. There is a hypothesis that we will have a second wave of COVID-19 in the fall, and most health sectors are trying to figure out how they can relieve some of this during this period. A number of your organizations, particularly in biotech, how do you help support this? How do you interact with the system at this point in time when they're looking for all this help? How do you help them with the supply chain? What are the critical, either critical drugs or substitution drugs that might be available? What are the critical pieces of equipment that they might be using, and what are the substitute for some of these critical pieces of equipment, from pumps to disposables to circuits to things like that they're using right now on either ventilators or surgical equipment that they're all sourcing right now. All of them are also doing a mild stockpiling right now because they don't want to get caught out. How do we now make sure that things are actually appropriately medical grade to be using? Different sectors actually inside society now, other than health organizations, are now actually looking at PPE and critical supplies that they'll use on their own, which are now becoming in short supply as well. Dentists and pharmacists and GPs who, dentists probably more so were wearing masks to begin with, but GPs weren't always wearing masks when they visited patients. Pharmacists definitely weren't wearing masks and gloves while they were talking to patients at pharmacies. And as well as now we have requests from organizations like police forces, fire departments, home health organizations that are looking for critical supplies as we're moving along. So the way that we've been supporting them right now is through more accurate demand modeling, as we're seeing what are the actual demands. And as I mentioned, for the provinces, overall, we've been fairly lucky. There's really not in Canada logarithmic or exponential growth in COVID cases here versus in other areas of the world. So we're being largely driven now by what we think and feel around the protocols that we'll deliver. Previously, people would be using masks and gloves and things like that, and they would doff their PPE after each time they saw a patient. Now we need to go to more PPE conserving methodology, and as well we need to look at how we're actually managing critical drug supply for that as well. How can we actually look at compounding to use critical ingredients that we can actually source and create things with? How can we use substitution to manage our supply? And what can we look at from a federal level that'll support a overall coordinated response in Canada? So in drugs, it's a little bit different. We do have more of a coordinated response from Health Canada. From a PPE level, each province is still sourcing their critical supplies and getting support from the federal government, but there's still, provinces that potentially are competing with each other in order to get these critical supplies. So from a supply chain perspective, there's still lots to happen right now. In recovery phase, as I'm mentioning, all of them are now planning for recovery phase. All of them want to start winding up their elective procedures in the next couple of weeks as they're looking at how to clear a backlog, because even though I'm calling them elective procedures, these really aren't elective for those people that are waiting for their surgeries. These are cancer surgeries to remove tumors. These are cataract surgeries to help people from going blind. These are surgeries that will replace hips and knees for people that are immobile right now, and they really can't wait too much longer as we start to wind these scenarios up. The issue that they'll have around making sure that these procedures are still taking place is that every person who goes in for an elective procedure will potentially need to be presumed as a COVID patient. So all the surgical staff will need to be wearing the coveted and rare N95 masks as they're performing surgery, because these are aerosol generating procedures as they're going forward. So a lot to think about and a lot to do. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And I guess am I handing over to Jason now?
Over to Stephen.
Stephen, thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. Hi, everybody. This is Stephen Lopes speaking from Deloitte. Like a number of my colleagues, I equally sit in an interesting spot, namely the government incentives world. So a number of the relief programs that Anita opened up, and a number of the relief programs that Joyce also mentioned fall into my wheelhouse. So my normal day job would be, programs traditionally run by NRCan, by the CRA, such as R&D tax credits, such as the IRAP program, such as SDTC funding that some of you may be familiar with throughout your different business and operations. Naturally, with the announcement of our landmark stimulus bills, a lot of my day job has now become wage subsidy specific, as well as any other COVID-19 relief measures that the government has announced. So I suspect many people on the call have heard their fair share of wage subsidy information, so I won't belabor a lot of the mechanics, other than to highlight the portal did open today, April 27th, as of this morning. So obviously the intake windows are now happening. And even with the portal opening and it having been announced, for a little over 2 weeks now, there's still a lot of complexity and a lot of risk associated with how the rules have actually been laid out. So at a very high level, while the government's intent has naturally been to try to create a program that was as broad-reaching and impactful as possible in terms of qualifying as many businesses as possible, in providing that flexibility, they introduced an immense amount of complexity around how you determine qualifying revenue, how you go about determining qualifying revenue when your fact patterns are not just straight sales to arm's length parties in Canada, what happens when you're pre-commercial. So a lot of those types of questions are still very much going through the throes of interpretation. And those are where we're supporting a number of our clients in developing defensible positions on how they've calculated their own eligibility. And naturally, that complexity also moves into the remuneration calculations. And one of the biggest challenges that our client base has been seeing so far, and many on this line are likely seeing as well, is what's currently available on CRA's portal in terms of a calculation tool seems quite straightforward and seems quite simple. The challenge that we're now unpacking is that a number of the core assumptions in that tool don't actually coincide with what's written in legislation. So the tool will calculate subsidy for employees that per legislation should not be eligible, simply because it's assuming that the people populating those tools have already made those determinations on a per employee basis, which is potentially a false assumption. So the reality is there's a lot of misinformation in the market, and naturally the Q&A, if there are specific questions that do crop up, I'm happy to field them. But I do want to caveat, naturally the program was put in force very hastily to try to get capital back into the hands of not just organizations, but more specifically to individual employees. After all, it is a wage reimbursement or subsidy, and to keep those people on payroll. In that haste, legislation that would normally have taken years to publish, to go through public discourse and analysis on, to get right, left a number of gaps. Some very significant gaps, in particular when you deal with operating partnership structures that have, say, BDC as one of its members. Those types of organizations currently don't fall within the regulations of the rules, which may impact a number of industries in the life science spaces, or a number of players in the life sciences space as well. So there are still some gaps in those rules, and the challenge when we do see gaps, and the challenge when we do understand there's a lot of misinformation, when you overlay that to the fact that there are some very heavy penalties associated with incorrect claims, false claims, or otherwise abusive claims to the program. So there's a significant risk profile now associated to the wage subsidy itself. And so we are working with our clients to try to manage that risk profile, to provide comfort where we can in terms of eligibility determinations and remuneration calculations, and to navigate what has become a bit of a hornet's nest in terms of qualification. With that, I did mention the pre-commercial type businesses, which with the life science sector can be quite relevant as well. In parallel to the portal opening this morning, the government announced IRAP's Innovation Assistance Program, IAP for short, which portal opened last 22nd. I can't remember what day of the week it is anymore because my days are a blur. That portal closes on the 29th. Now, the foundational assumption in the IAP program is that you cannot access the wage subsidy because you do not meet the eligibility requirements from a revenue decline perspective. That is the core assumption. That said, the amount of funding available in IAP is only $250 million relative to the 70+ billion that has been earmarked for the wage subsidy, which if program extensions do come into force that we do anticipate might, it could easily break 150 quite quickly. So the prize pool there is much smaller. So the amount that might actually get distributed to companies will likely be significantly lower. And the intake is competitive. It is not an entitlement-based program like the wage subsidy is, meaning that as long as you meet the criteria of eligibility, you get access to it. The IAP program is a competitive one. And based on how the questionnaire has been designed and the intake has been designed, again, a very simple questionnaire and intake, but it's quite clear that in the 8 questions they do ask that they're weighting the scores of those questions. So as much as this is conjecture at this point, because no one really knows how NRCan will ultimately administer the program, we do expect that it will be basically a weighted average scoring system. They will apportion dollars to the top X% of companies, and anyone below that score just won't be receiving any funds. So it might not be quite the fix that everyone was hoping for to compensate for pre-commercial businesses. And when I say for pre-commercial businesses in particular, a number of the questions in IAP actually focus towards you already having a commercial product and you already having revenue growth patterns, which again, knowing that means that you probably could have gotten access to wage subsidies seems like an odd thing to be contemplating. But the rules within the wage subsidy are so that you do have to meet very specific declines in very specific periods. So just putting that out there in terms of an additional program that is available. And naturally, I can't not be on a call and put in a plug for what the government normally offers on every other day of the year, it being the SR&ED program, the IRAP program itself, the volume of hiring grants that exist when you bring on new individuals within your organization, when you export into new markets. So in essence, where we've been going down this path right now of, okay, let's access the subsidy with a number of our clients. Once that first subsidy intake is taken care of, what other cash flow management tools do you have in your toolbox and at your disposal? And then the next step downstream is what does 6 to 18 months look like for your businesses? Where do you plan on redeploying new capital if you can get access to that capital? And knowing that plan now can help you set up for getting access to the volume of more merit-based or competitive type funding programs that exist in the open market, which may include the Strategic Innovation Fund, it might include the Sustainable Development Technology Fund, as well as any specific provincial programs that do get rolled out over the next wave. We do fully anticipate another wave of stimulus bills to be passed at the tail end of this pandemic. We've basically labeled this current wave as the keep capital markets liquid, keep rents paid, keep mortgages paid stimulus bill. The next bill will be get everyone back to work and more productive. So that is what we do anticipate to be in the pipeline. And it is what we are seeing in other countries that are starting to already come out of their pandemic curves, that they are now starting to offer other forms of incentivization to encourage reinvestment of capital in those businesses. So we would expect Canada to naturally follow suit. So with that, I'll pass the mic on to Jason, and naturally, if there are any questions, I'm happy to field them at the end of the call.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it. And I'm sure you're going to be getting a ton of calls or a ton of questions at the end of this. Certainly on the IRAP, the new IRAP program, and of course with the new portal opening on the wage subsidy program today. Thanks very much. For those on the phone, my name is Jason Ding. I lead the corporate finance practice for Deloitte's life science healthcare sector nationally. Before I start, I just want to say a big thank you to healthcare workers, to research and development scientists who are working on therapeutics, vaccines, diagnostic products for COVID, and all the essential workers. Really appreciate all the work you're doing in this tough time. My short little discussion today is going to be on the capital markets and a bit of an update on some of what we're seeing in the capital markets. We've been in discussion with a number of business owners over the last couple of weeks, of course, and months, and a couple of themes have emerged. So, many have completed their 13-week cash flow forecasts. A lot of owners and executives are focused on drawing down on all the government support programs, trying to stay on top of all the various changes that are happening as these programs continue to evolve. Certainly extending for those companies that have bank debt, extending bank debt maturities and getting deferrals in place. Certainly diversifying capital sources if that's possible, and just understanding that there's an acceptance. I think that there's higher rates of interest that they're going to see as part of that capital from their capital sources. On the capital advisory side, I would say, on the lender end, banks certainly are still open for business and very much are focused on their existing client base. Most of them have done a lot in terms of contingency lines of credit as companies look to continue to shore up their liquidity state. As a result, though, we are definitely seeing, and we've heard lots from our banking colleagues, that bank balance sheets are certainly stretched right now. They are looking at new transactions, but anything that's sort of a stretch deal is going to be quite difficult right now. And so they're looking for deals that are down the middle of the fairway, I think is the way one banker put it. And certainly, of course, from a risk premium perspective, we've heard in general that spreads have widened 200 to 300 basis points. In some cases in the U.S., we've actually been hearing 200 to 400 basis points. And part of that as well is just around diligence and some of the uncertainty in the underwriting process and how much of a challenge that is right now. On the private debt fund side, companies are still looking, but primarily they're looking at buying opportunities in the secondary markets, where that publicly traded paper has a track record, and they don't have to spend a ton of time with underwriting. And then on the equity market side, which we don't do a ton of work in, but certainly have been involved in a couple of transactions recently. Generally from the investor perspectives, fundamentals remain unchanged. Part of the challenge right now is just trying to figure out how to get the valuation right. And I would say that in general, they are looking at a higher bar of opportunities, and they're looking for lower risk, higher quality opportunities to invest in. On the merger and acquisition side, we are still seeing deals in the life science and healthcare space move ahead. in general, in most of our other markets, which have basically been put on pause or where deals have been canceled. In the life sciences and healthcare space, we've seen a few in food and ag and a few in tech, particularly health tech. Those deals continue to move forward. In terms of those that were in process when COVID-19 hit, certainly those processes, we have not seen too many of those fall off, and they continue on in this sector. But anyone that's looking to kick off a new process is going to be fairly challenged, I think, with approaching companies with new deals. Diligence, has largely gone virtual, and so that, for the most part, has been, manageable through this time. Generally, data rooms are virtual now, and so people can go in, investors can go in and do the diligence that they want to do. Site visits obviously are a big challenge right now. And certainly management presentations are evolving as they're done virtually. I think that, in terms of the deals that we're running right now, 4-hour, 5-hour management presentations which would be typical as part of a conversation in person. Online is just quite a long stretch, and so we're seeing our processes start to break up management presentations into different segments, and site visits, being promised for later. Although I did hear of one transaction where someone actually flew a drone in and did a virtual tour using a drone. So certainly more calls and more discussions. Multiples, of course, are being impacted, partly because of the debt availability that I talked about a little earlier in this discussion, and as portfolio managers are continuing to focus on the state of their own business. Where we are seeing more difficulty is actually in integration and closing. So inventory counts, IT system consolidation, financial integrations, a lot of that stuff that needs discussions with staff and announcing deals, where you want some of that in-person workings as part of the integration process. That's where we're seeing a lot of the challenges in our transactions right now. And then also terms. So we're starting to see earnouts be quite prevalent in some of the terms that are being proposed. Holdbacks related to companies getting back to pre-COVID revenues, and certainly rep and warranty impacts as well, which I know our legal colleagues have talked about a lot over the last couple of weeks. So with that, maybe what I'll do is just end it with a quick reminder on things to be focused on over the next little while. Get ahead of it, of course. If you haven't yet, complete your 13-week cash flow forecast. And as Stephen mentioned earlier, when you get that done and you guys, everyone's sort of figured out where they're at, start moving to 26-week forecasts, so you can start looking at how that might apply to some of the government programs. Treat your lenders, treat your investors like partners. Keep them up to date, informed, and providing advice on where you're at and how you intend to proceed going forward. For those with debt and banks as partners, lock in your rates early. Make sure that you get your deferrals in place as quickly as possible. Of course, take advantage of government programs, and then consider new sources of capital. Think about asset-based debt if you have assets, sale of redundant assets in order to create some additional liquidity, and think about private equity and venture capital, and think about your next round of funding. So with that, I will pass it back to Emily, and we can start the Q&A session.
Great, thanks so much, Jason. I do have one question that's come in so far. It's kind of a two-part question. I believe it is directed at Stephen. So the first part of the question is, can you provide a description of the revised IRAP program? And the second part is, what are the 8 questions Stephen is referring to, and where can you find them?
For sure. So the revised IRAP program, it's not actually a revision to IRAP. It is a new stream that is managed by IRAP. So the old IRAP program that some of you may be familiar with in terms of putting forward a project application, getting salaries and contractor dollars funded once you're approved for that application, that stream still exists, and if they have money, we'll still be providing money. The new stream is what they call the IAP program, which is specific to COVID-19 relief. It was opened on the 22nd, closes on the 29th. We don't know yet if there will be another intake subject to how successful this first intake is. But it is meant to essentially act as a wage subsidy for companies that have not been able to access the actual Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. So knowing that the CEWS program is all driven on requisite declines in revenue. So if you meet the 15% decline for March, 30 for April, 30 for May, you can access the 75% wage subsidy program at the federal level that's administered by the CRA. But for organizations that are either pre-revenue or their revenue patterns haven't taken a hit, but they are still otherwise impacted by COVID-19. So you might end up in situations where the most common case that I've seen so far is, a company that was in the midst of doing a capital raise, and capital markets are now much more hesitant to be releasing funds to those organizations right now. This program is hopefully giving them, a few more months of run room to allow the markets to untighten again. So the program is accessible through the same IRAP page. There are links to be able to access those amounts, and I guess we could circulate those links at the end of the call or in the response box. And the questions they ask, like I said, it's a very simple intake form. The only prerequisite for even beginning to apply is that you do not qualify for the major wage subsidy program. Originally, as designed, they had also said you do not qualify for the BDC or EDC lending programs. That has since been removed. So it's just the only requisite being that you do not qualify for the wage subsidy and that you are otherwise somehow impacted by the pandemic. So a very broad definition as to what that might mean. And the 8 questions that they've actually asked, and we can also circulate, we've pulled them off of the application page and into an Excel file so people can refer to them. But in essence, it does require you to describe, it's all drop-down questions, very limited amount of space in terms of you to put any narrative. Hence why we believe it's a scored weighted question, because it's just drop-downs. And it goes everything from describing your business's ability to execute on the commercialization of your products. Is there any formal engineering, R&D, or new product or innovation in the product? Is what's your current run rate like in terms of cash? How much cash you have left in bank? What's your revenue patterns? What's your revenue growth patterns? So those are the types of generic questions, and they are quite generic because there isn't much space, if any, to actually provide additional clarity on any of the questions. Only a handful of the questions have a comment box, and the comment boxes are limited to 2,500 characters. So you're not writing a PhD dissertation to convince anyone. It is very quick, snappy responses. And again, it is merit-based. So we can definitely provide a link to the main application page. And again, the intake window does close in 48 hours. So if your organization has come to the conclusion that it does not qualify for CEWS, or in other cases, companies that are still going through the determination process and may or may not qualify for CEWS, we are advising go apply for IAP. In the event you do conclude you did qualify for CEWS, you can retract your IAP application or refund the money. So not closing that door to you if you're still on the fence as to which program you may or may not have access to.
Great, thank you, Stephen. There's one comment further to that point you just made. To have access to the 8 questions, you have to log in on the NRC IRAP platform and complete the online form. And then your next question, Stephen, do you yet have a sense as to how the money will be channeled through the regional development agencies?
So the majority of the money that's been earmarked for regional development agencies has been essentially allowing companies to defer repayment of funding. A number of the regional economic agencies have introduced COVID-19 specific programs where if you have a product or solution that you believe may help resolve the pandemic in some way, whether it be health related or otherwise, that you will be able to also potentially apply for very specific intake streams depending on what region you are in. At this point, none of the agencies have provided any broader type of reinvestment plans. The way we've interpreted the language from the federal government thus far has been giving those agencies more capital simply to deal with the fact they are not receiving repayments on funds currently. So their normal intakes are still open, and some have introduced COVID-19 specific solution intakes as well.
Great, thank you. Now, this question hasn't been directed to a specific speaker, so I'll let you guys figure out who is best to answer it. What are the limitations or constraints in ramping up mass testing, assuming that it is part of opening up the economy broadly?
Can we, Emily, can we actually skip that question for now and we'll come back to it? I think that's probably a question for Joyce.
Okay, great. Next question, is it possible to claim contractors under the IAP, even though you are eligible for employees in CEWS?
So the base assumption for applying for IAP is that your organization does not qualify for Qs. So the Qs program, in theory, would be available to your contractors themselves if they have met the requisite revenue declines. But as my son comes to say hello. So that is so the simple answer is no, you shouldn't be applying for IAP if you already qualify for the Qs program on your employees.
Okay, thank you. One criteria to qualify for AIP, or probably IAP, is lack of sufficient financial resources to sustain operations from April 1st, 2020 to June 23rd, 2020 inclusive. So does this mean that a company that has cash until June 23rd but runs out of cash after that date in July or August could not apply?
So the short answer is one of the questions that they actually ask on the intake is how much cash you actually have left to burn. And some of the responses include, 2 years worth of cash run. So given that statement, I would not preclude you from applying, but you do have to make the statement of the pandemic has somehow affected your ability to generate or operate from a cash flow perspective. And that is one of the weighted questions they will be asking. So no, you don't have to be, at the point of running out of money in the next 6 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever that math comes out to at this point. But you do have to be able to articulate some type of cash impact on being caused by the pandemic.
Great, thank you. We have another comment. Prior to start completing the form, you need to know the amount of the revenue the company made in 2019, which is line 8299 from Schedule 125.
Can confirm, yes.
Okay.
You do need to have your revenue numbers because again, that is one of the questions that they are asking on the IAP intake is what is the revenues of the business? And they do point to your tax return line item as being one source of disclosing that revenue.
Okay, if there are any other questions from the audience, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A feature now. Joyce, if you're still on the line and listening, there is a question that was, I think, probably directed to you.
Yeah, can you repeat the question, Emily?
Of course, yes. What are the limitations or constraints in ramping up mass testing, assuming that it is part of opening up the economy more broadly?
Joyce, you might be on mute.
Sorry, I'm back.
Great. Did you catch that?
Sorry, I just had a little bit of audio trouble. Can you just repeat that, please?
Of course, yes. What are the limitations or constraints in ramping up mass testing, assuming that it is part of opening up the economy more broadly?
Well, I mean, the biggest limitation is going to be the actual tests. I don't think that there's a specific test that's been agreed that's going to be the right one that's going to be able to scale on a mass usage perspective. And so really right now, a lot of the work has been focused on both testing, but then also contact tracing. So contact tracing is something that the Alberta government right now has announced that they're going to be doing. And the other provinces are now taking a look at that as well. But those are going to be critical factors in the ramp up prior to getting any vaccine that, is still probably another at least 18 months away in order to understand where people have potentially been exposed.
Great. Thank you so much, Joyce.
Thank you.
And now, no other questions. I don't see any more coming in. I would just like to turn over the microphone to Andrew Casey, President and CEO of Biotech Canada. I think he wanted to give a quick thank you.
Hang on.
There you go. We hear you.
There I go. That's better. Look at my dog. Thank you, Anita, Joyce, Stephen, and Jason. Really, really appreciate your expertise. Your breadth of expertise is fantastic. Obviously, you guys are really busy right now. I think there's a lot of moving parts here, a lot of stuff to follow. So we really appreciate you taking the time to do this today. Stephen, I think as you pointed out on the programs like the IRAP and others, you know, they rushed it out the door. It's not perfect. They're still in the state of flux, still trying to figure things out. So some of your guidance today is particularly helpful for the smaller companies as we navigate this. I would only ask of our member companies as you're going through this, if you are experiencing difficulties, to reach out to us and let us know, because we can try and help at this end with the government. They've been somewhat flexible. As you know, the original plan was just to go with the wage subsidy program for those companies that have experienced a loss of revenue. This is problematic, obviously, for most of our companies because there is no revenue in most companies. And so we've been asked through the government to address that. The measure through the IRAP is the one way they've tried to do that. And so if it is not working properly, let us know, and we'll take measures to have that addressed. So that's a huge piece of it. And then that was it. I wanted to just thank everybody for participating. We've got some more coming up. Emily, I'll let you tell everybody about the other ones. But again, to the Deloitte team, thank you very, very much. Your expertise is greatly appreciated in your time. And thanks for supporting the membership. Really appreciate it.
And just to echo Andrew, thank you so much, Team Deloitte, for helping us out today. Great insights. And then yes, coming up this week, we've got on Wednesday, same time, we have Norton Rose Fulbright giving a presentation on employment issues. And then on Thursday, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, we have Gowling, WLG. They are going to be speaking a little bit more on other government programs available to small biotech companies. And with that, is there anyone from Deloitte who wanted to comment or say anything before we wrap up? I'll give you a minute now.
Only just to say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. Really appreciate it, and good luck to everyone during these times.
Okay. Thanks so much. And with that, I think I will end the call. Thank you to everyone who joined.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Everyone.